Good afternoon and welcome to another Webinar Wednesday. We're excited to have over 250 registered attendees for today's webinar, which is eligible for 1 credit from the ACI. As always, we want to get started today by giving one of our attendees a chance to win those very popular Technation Tour t-shirts for answering this week's trivia question. Our sponsor today is PartsSource. They are headquartered in Ohio, so we want to know, who is Cleveland's most famous Olympian? Answer now using the question feature on your dashboard. While you're busy Googling the answer and answering the question, I do want to remind everyone that you are invited to the MD Expo Fall Conference. It brings HTM professionals from across the nation to Orlando for 3 days. If you want to find out more about the MD Expo and potentially watch a really great video that will give you some insight into the conference, you can visit mdexposhow.com. Also, our sponsor today, PartsSource, has been very nice to offer a complimentary admission VIP pass to all of the attendees today. You can get your VIP pass that was in the workbook that was emailed out earlier today. Or if you did not receive the workbook, you can download a copy now on your dashboard under the handout section titled PDF Workbook. All right, let's see who the winner of Technation's Tour shirt is. It is Stephen Kovic. Stephen, congratulations. You were correct that the answer is Jesse Owens. Webinar Wednesday would like to thank our sponsor, PartsSource. PartsSource is the industry-leading provider of biomedical and imaging replacement parts through comprehensive technology tools. As a single source for parts procurement, their top priority is delivering outstanding service to clinical engineering, facilities, and supply chain departments. You can learn more about this company by visiting PartsSource.com for more information. Our presenters today are Will Kinsey, Vice President of Client Services at PartsSource, and Greg Doherty, Executive Director of Clinical Asset Management at UnityPoint Health. Will, you may begin whenever you are ready.
All right. Thank you, Jamie. I'm just going to go through some prepared words just to make sure I don't miss anything. Of course, thank you for joining us on today's webinar, Best Practices to Improve Quality in the Supply Chain, hosted by us, PartsSource. Before we begin, please note this is all being recorded and it will be emailed to you at the end of it. Please feel free to share the email with any colleagues that were unable to attend. And at the end of the presentation, we'll be taking questions, and you will be muted during the presentation to minimize the background noise. Because of this, if you'd like to ask a question or report technical difficulties, please do so by using the chat function on your screen. I did want to mention specifically a little bit of background on Greg. As Jamie mentioned, Greg Doherty is the Executive Director of Clinical Asset Management for UnityPoint. Prior to UnityPoint, Greg worked his way up through 2 multi-vendor service organizations, which gives him a unique outside-in perspective on service contracts, asset management, and overall cost management. So that's why we were really excited to have him on the phone with us. And Greg, if you can, give a little bit of background on UnityPoint for those who may not know.
Excellent. Yes, thanks, Will. I sure can. UnityPoint Health is the nation's 13th largest nonprofit health system and the 4th largest non-denominational health system in the United States. We are headquartered in Des Moines, Iowa. However, we are located in 9 regions across 3 states, Wisconsin, Illinois, and Iowa. We have 19 acute care UnityPoint Health hospitals, just over 280 physician clinics, and then we have a network of over 18 community hospitals, 15 at-home locations, 4 accredited colleges, and 10 affiliated partners across the 3-state area. We're licensed for just under 4,000 acute care beds as a senior affiliate level, providing a great continuum of care across the Midwest.
Excellent. That is impressive and quite a scope of an organization. And just as I was touching on Greg's impressive background, I was taken aback when he said he was brought on and someone looks him in the eye and says, we have to take out $3 million in cost. And Greg said, okay, we'll do it. So an excellent resource, just an overall cost management and how to get a job done that seems impossible. A little bit of background on myself, Will Kinsey. I have been a supply chain dedicated resource, an operations dedicated resource, and even sales. Currently in client services, and client services, for all who do not know, is everything inside of PartsSource that is customer facing but does not involve a service part. So we are the voice of the customer that goes out there and works with them to implement new business, but also technical integrations, any sort of technical support. That is all through our department. So as we dive into the PowerPoint, which I was already behind one slide, that's us. And then clicking through, we will be going through 5 total sections on the PowerPoint. First, the introduction, then some risks that are involved in supply chain. We'll go through quite a few industry challenges and then best practices to deal with those challenges, and then ultimately conclude the slides. All right, this one I'd like to turn over to Greg. Greg, it seems like inside of HTM, quality issues are fairly common. It says here 1 in 4 hospital staff report an expired or recalled product used on a patient. And inside of HTM, we know that to be the case. That would be a higher number than 1 out of 4. So I was wondering if you could give an example from your earlier past that caused you to have quality on your radar. Before, this incident, maybe it would be an afterthought, but what caused quality to creep up to the top of your radar?
Sure. Yeah, and I would say you're absolutely correct, Will. I think most of those that are listening to this call and anyone that's been engaged in healthcare technology management for a day, maybe an hour, understands that there hasn't been a time when quality is not the way of life for us. As I thought back related to quality, I can recall experiences, even very early on in my career as a technician, where I was impacted by a bad lot of batteries. I remember the things that went through my head from questioning my technical ability, as we waded through identifying a quality issue, the frustration from having to go back through a lot of work. So from a frontline employee perspective, I can really tell you the impact of quality impacted me every day that I was turning a wrench. And left a lasting impact on me. And I think as PartsSource sees this, my vendor suppliers see this with UnityPoint Health. It does impact a great deal the level of trust we place in our partners moving forward. And so as a leader, I still look back on that and the impact it had. I see that we've made tremendous changes, but we're still constantly managing the processes in supply chain as they relate to healthcare technology management so that we can proactively address those issues. And more importantly, I think, especially as we kick this discussion off, we're consistently collecting and analyzing data, every day between supply chain and myself on the supply chain team. We're meeting with suppliers and vendors, rounding with our clinical customers, all in all to ensure that we're providing the highest quality products and services to our patients and clinicians. At the same time, we're trying to, evaluate and improve.
Excellent. I know many departments are listening to this call just asking themselves, what can we do specifically that would affect quality of the supply chain? How does that affect down the line? How does that affect our overall hospital? And I hope we can get to some of those inside of this presentation and get your 1 credit hour worth for sure.
Absolutely.
And then looking at this slide, the key to any sort of quality monitoring is to do that monitoring proactively, managing your supply chain proactively. And we have some fun facts on here, especially since the one fun fact in the middle, that 1/3 of the total supply base is normally being managed by any given hospital system. And that is because the hospital is dealing with so many suppliers. Usually when you think about quality management, working with suppliers and trying to get those suppliers to do better, you'll start with the big three, Philips, Siemens, GE, and saying, what are they doing for us? How are their parts delivering for us? But then you have a long tail of suppliers, and the long tail of suppliers, that could actually be differentiated based on the engineer, an engineer's preference, a department's preference. Greg, I know, is dealing with many acute care facilities with staff clinical engineering departments, and inside each one of those facilities, people have their own preferences, and of those facilities, the individuals have their own preferences. So it gets to be quite complex, and trying to manage all of those suppliers proactively, other than just being cost prohibitive, is basically impossible. So as we'll go through here, and more risks that are applying to the supply chain, we'll start to talk about some of the benefits of consolidating those suppliers that you currently buy from.
Sure.
Back to you.
Yeah, and as you talk about fun facts, Will, I'll give the group on the phone an example. In the last 45 days at UnityPoint, to your example of having 9 regions, 19 acute care facilities, personalities, amplified, multiplied, we've purchased from just over 150 suppliers in the last 45 days. So as you think about managing quality issues and just the sheer volume of work, with technicians doing, several hundreds of thousands of preventive maintenances across the U.S. on a monthly basis, sprinkle in your repairs, your supplier interactions can multiply in a really, really fast fashion, and then clearly, take a quality issue that might be tiny when you talk about the long tail of suppliers, maybe a local battery supplier as an example, and you all of a sudden push a lot of orders one direction, and you can have a quality issue that you can't measure fast enough before you know it. So, the issues we face as an industry and my team faces aren't unique, clearly to UnityPoint by any means, nor were they unique to the other independent service organizations I worked for in the past. Matter of fact, they're really not unique to healthcare technology management, and I think that's one of the things that I like to impart on my peers and folks that I mentor and work with is, supply chain is really that. It's a supply chain. Every organization, every medical device manufacturer goes through that. The workflow in reality, when we talk about our repair engagement with a specific preventive maintenance or a work order that's identified, that workflow isn't necessarily any different as well. You may add some flavor, add some steps. And I think one of the things that we want to try to draw out of this toward the end too is you don't necessarily have to add hundreds and hundreds of steps. There's lots of different ways to manage your supply chain quality issues. Some of that is through clearly identifying the right suppliers, and then just measuring what you expect. But if we look at the workflow that's on the slide from part need identified, all the way out to, we spend the money on the product and the provider managing, the invoices, returns, and all that other fun stuff. I'll give you some input into the KPIs that we use to try to identify quality issues really as early on in the cycle as humanly possible. And I think for most folks, these will be pretty standard KPIs, but with some flavor on how you might evaluate them as a function of looking at it from supply chain quality. It's no different than we're a portion of the supply chain, right? We're providing a service as healthcare technology management. So, one of the ways in which we do that very early on as a team is productivity, right? And you can measure productivity in a lot of different ways, but clearly from looking at the amount of time you're spending doing work in a process as opposed to managing a process. So very early on with UnityPoint, one of the things we clearly identified is, we had, 100 employees looking for parts on their own and managing different catalogs of parts. When you start to measure work time on equipment and try to benchmark best-in-class, best standards as an outcome for medical device repairs, managing alternate equipment maintenance, and those types of things. Productivity is really one of those early on key elements that you can identify. You might have a supplier issue because we measure our suppliers in the same way. We put the data in the same way that we put our own employees' time in. So you begin to see a lack of productivity of the devices themselves as it relates to delivering patient care. So that's one really important KPI for us. A second one is sustainability. Clearly, I think there's probably not anybody that hasn't heard, we want to find sustainable solutions. And I would encourage people to think of that in two different ways, right? The magic bullet that everybody hears really is, I want to save money. And while that's very imperative, clearly this topic here is the cost of quality. And so you can go find, less than quality parts and save a lot of money on the front side, but it does impact the productivity. And clearly it changes, your ability to manage the long-term cost in the medical equipment environment, because you can continue to have to manage returns. You continue to have to negotiate with other suppliers. By no means am I necessarily saying there's not dollars to find out there and consistent, repeatable processes, but that's really what we mean by sustainable solutions, is trying to find the best-in-class, best-in-quality solution and then just continuing to repeat it. And then clearly uptime and downtime. I think internally as we measure suppliers, those are our initial KPIs as we think through, what are some of the things today likely that all HTM departments are measuring. And a lot of that, again, if you take a 30,000 viewpoint of the biomed department, the clinical engineering department, the healthcare technology management department, and you take one step back and look at those KPIs, while they tell you a little bit about your efficiency and your effectiveness, the reality is they're a pretty good global measurement of your supplier standards. No different than your Siemens, your GEs, your third-party providers. They're all measuring that for a lot of different reasons, and it's, am I able to be as effective and efficient as possible? And then the other thing that clearly we do, Will, is whether or not we're able to gain efficiencies in managing ordering through our ERP itself. Whether you have an ERP or not, is what your purchasing process looks like can change your productivity. What your vendor supplier of choice looks like can change your productivity. And so I think those are some of the key points, when you talk about how do we adhere to quality standards, how do we get pricing transparency, response time and accuracy. We'll talk a little bit about some of those individual things in a moment, but when I think about the KPIs, that we're looking to manage, at least at a high level, which you can't see. So when we start managing and measuring the deviations to some of those KPIs themselves, they start to give us a little bit more direction, just looking at that top 1/3 spend and evaluating only those suppliers.
I would really like to, this is Will again, I'd really like to focus on the long tail of suppliers, but as it pertains to best in class. So Greg spoke quite a lot on best in class and how do we achieve that? What does that look like? What are some of the specific measurements that we use? And I think if you asked any HTM professional, any biomedical imaging professional and say, what is your goal? It's to increase patient safety. It is to decrease costs, increase uptime. Everybody is quick to have these goals, but when it comes down to the tactical application of those goals through one person's service or another person's service, it starts to get wildly different. And if you look here at this chart, the average suppliers, 186, maximum of 850 for a 0 to 1,000 bed facility. Now, the thing is, it says suppliers, but this is actually the count of OEMs that are being serviced. So you may buy one OEM's equipment, buy parts or what have you from 10 different suppliers to support GE or Siemens, and you may not even know it. You may have just multiple people buying the same modality off of different suppliers. So the reason why I focus on best in class is to say, an example of ultrasound. If you have two different ultrasound engineers that work on nothing but ultrasound, and you believe that you're providing a best-in-class service to the organization, yet those two engineers buy from two different suppliers. One engineer prefers this supplier, one engineer prefers this supplier, and there's many different reasons why those engineers might prefer one over the other. Might be in line with where they got training, it might be in line with how they feel the speed of the parts comes out, but I would challenge managers to work with their engineers and say, what is the best solution? What is the best supplier for us? If we're working with two, then it has to be one of these two, but we all know how great it is when you have a core supplier that takes the time to come to you on a quarterly basis and say, here's how we're performing. Here's how we're performing in these individual areas. You should expect this from us going forward, and you should expect nothing less than this after that issue that we just fixed last quarter. So that's what you should expect out of all of your suppliers, but you can't have that if you're watering down your spend by spending through multiple avenues. And if one engineer has a preference, one engineer has a preference, my challenge to managers is to work with them to find out what is the true preference. You know, if the hospital or the health system is going to go in this direction in ultrasound, that training that we got 5 years ago doesn't mean anything at this point. So where do we go from here? That is my challenge to everyone, because of course, as we consolidate all of these countless suppliers, the efficiencies that go through the process, the benefits to the organization, the cost savings, and the value added that the reporting that come along certainly is well worth it. So here, and again, this is to touch on another area that Greg spoke of, the overall procure-to-pay process, which isn't something that people in our industry thought about much in prior decades, and due to certain constraints put on the industry now with more accounting regularities, more people watching what the overall procurement process is, more holistic software and ERP platforms in the industry just dominating how we buy. It's come to the forefront, and it's important to note. And I want to explain just on a global level how this affects the department's productivity, because if you're calling to get a good price on 2 or 3 suppliers for a single part, that actually takes up somewhere around 30 minutes to 44 minutes to 45 minutes because you're calling multiple sources. Some of those times that cause the average to go forward, you're sitting on hold. You can sit on hold with the OEM for easily 10 minutes. You can call up another supplier. When you call those suppliers, you may actually have a personal relationship with those suppliers, and you talk a little bit, and that conversation might go on 5 or 10 minutes. So when we've done time studies in organizations, we find just the sourcing process and then the requisition process takes 44 minutes on average. That's significant. That's before it even gets out of the department. Once it gets into the department, the creation of the purchase order, the calling in the purchase order, sometimes using facts, but then following up on the purchase order, what is our confirmation number? This could take on average 21 minutes. And then finally, the order reconciliation, receipt of goods, payment, any sort of reconciliation that has to take place that brings it back to procurement, that might then procurement sends it back to clinical engineering to say, I don't understand this. We only have these line items on the purchase order, yet this line item came in. What's the difference? Your pricing is slightly off from this. Those sort of downtimes and inefficiencies drastically affect the overall efficiency of the organization and the efficiency of your department. I've talked to multiple purchasing organizations in the country who say that half of their time is spent on rework. That's pretty impressive and also pretty alarming. So if you imagine, we all know the guy that sits in the corner of the shop and has his 5 part numbers written on an index card, and every time he needs those, he marks that price down, sends it off in the requisition, and moves on. But when you do that, your pricing's off, your details are off. It gets to AP, they can't pay. It gets to purchasing, they can't approve of anything because it's different than the requisition that was submitted. They have to go back to the original requester and ask if it's approved, and it is a major waste throughout the process. All right. Going into here, how do you prevent quality issues in the supply chain? Another industry challenge. We'll go back to Greg.
Excellent. Thanks, Will. Yeah, just to put a bow on that last slide and kind of segue into this one, what I would encourage people to think about, there's critical points in the process that are outside of healthcare technology management or clinical engineering that frankly, they're helpful to be aware of and understand. And I can't think of a time when I've worked with clinical engineering team members that don't have the organization's absolute best interest at heart, in managing their supplier relationships at a very, very local level. To have the battery gentleman from across town drop everything and bring you batteries whenever you need them and those types of things. But, I would say as you talk about managing quality and efficiency, and not that those providers don't provide a quality product in an efficient manner, but UnityPoint embarked in 2015 on standardizing our enterprise resource planning system across, our entire continuum. And I can tell you, it was eye-opening for me, the sheer number of vendors and suppliers that we have to manage in a system of this size when everyone wants to choose their own personal suppliers. So you have the impact of managing hundreds of vendors on an annual basis just to meet tax requirements, and to make sure that they're a payables vendor. And then not to mention the constant churn of, do you still continue to do business with these folks? And likely the frustration that's impacting your productivity and ultimately your work output quality for every time you order something from a supplier you haven't paid in a year and a half, and only then to have to go back through the paperwork, right? So you're not managing the quality of that long-tailed supplier, and you're only doing business with them on maybe a once every 18 months basis. That's just not fueling an efficient supply chain. So that's one big thing. And more so as systems tend to get larger and larger as meeting contracting and funding requirements. So many facilities have grant funding requirements, excuse me, and state requirements to participate in programs that require you to do business with a certain type of vendor on a ratio basis, and that X amount of your suppliers have to be evaluated for criteria to do business with your health systems. So that's also an important known quantity. And then, if you're in a connected system, clearly then there's manager challenges for clinical engineering, for healthcare technology management. So if your CMMS software system is linked to your purchasing system, having to manage that sheer volume of inventory and all the items that you can purchase from all those suppliers can be a really, really big burden. So, those are some of the things to think about when we say, how do I prevent the quality issues that you see on the slide now? How do I get visibility to cost? How can I effectively manage supply? How do I get rid of waste? So when we think of, visibility to supplier cost to quality, we have a current example now where we've begun to get refurbished parts on OEM original contracts. And so, just in the last 30 days, we've experienced some quality issues as it relates to parts coming even from an OEM. I was as surprised as most people would be to see, the issues that we've had. And while they're managing them, it does begin, you begin to question, even if the original equipment manufacturer can have quality supply issues, and then you look at that from a CT impact perspective, think about the cost of quality. So you've gone through 3 orders of a part on a CT scanner only to find that you've had 3 more instances of downtime. So that's reactive measurement of quality issues. Think of all the proactive quality issues that you're not looking at when you're skating along just fine over several years with a supplier, not really having a good evaluation system in place. So that's something for the folks on the call to evaluate and think about. Then when it comes to effective management, excuse me, as I mentioned, when issues present themselves, it's real easy. But I would advise most of you, if you're D&D accredited or Joint Commission, there is NIHO standards and Joint Commission standards related to the effective management of suppliers. We've started to see an increase across our hospital system where we're getting audited on a routine basis, and one of their really glaring questions, especially as it relates to the to the AEM and the FDA's new guidance related to potentially a change in management of how repairs are managed outside of the manufacturer certifications. What are we doing to improve the effective management and qualification of our suppliers? And I would tell you, even at UnityPoint, we still struggle with how do we make sure we're managing greater than that 1/3, of our largest spend. And that's a challenge. And then clearly the waste and the rework due to quality, I think they speak for themselves. I think some of that, what I would tell you is an effective rating system isn't just the quality of the product that you're receiving and how frequently you're receiving it to the specifications of how you ordered it the next day or to the second day, the third day. Excuse me. I think a lot of quality metrics too have to go back to the supply chain side of how frequently is the pricing correct? Is that vendor willing to communicate with my purchasing and payables team electronically? How often do we have to go back in that cycle, that very expensive cycle, of payment management and credit management, as opposed to having a front to back, procure to pay solution that's accurate 85 to 95% of the time, as opposed to 55, maybe 65% of the time. So, those are important things that I don't think most of our technicians need to think about, but it is something that when you talk about, suppliers of choice as opposed to contractors that are being managed and effectively managed, something to clearly think about. So, when we talk about managing quality in that arena and how we brought, so there's really 4 things on the previous slide that Will had up that we've identified as some best practices, just kind of shifting away from challenges for a minute. And there's 4 key elements that I want to talk to this group about, and we'll add some flavor to a couple of these. While these may not be all of them, I think these address a primary scope of most of the challenges that you have. And we've got some talking points for all 4 of these. So, moving right into broadening the scope of supplier assessments, as I said, if you go out and Google the NIHO standards or the D&V or the Joint Commission recommendations, the best practices and the requirements for managing your supply chain, clearly, it's of significant importance to make sure that we're managing the overall quality that people are providing to us. I don't think anybody would question that. But when you think about why is the Joint Commission interested in your suppliers? Clearly, I think most people are accustomed to meeting, what used to be the 100% and 95% PM completion, which is now the 100% PM completion for life support and non-life support. And so I think as we continue to see improvement in arena, speaking specifically to HTM, now they're really focused on what is your infrastructure like to decrease the negative impact from supply to the patient. Because clearly the people that miss out the most when we don't have a supplier that's being managed or a quality issue is the patient on the front side of that CT or X-ray or ultrasound or infusion treatment, because they're missing therapy as a result of mismanaging quality. But I think the other important things to the institution are your profit and your brand reputation, right? Because clearly as that can go up and down the entire continuum of the health system. So investing in the infrastructure to enable that broader visibility to your base, and then, clearly working with your industry peers on ways to improve that, I think are pretty important. And Will touched on a couple of things. I just want to throw this out, and then we'll transition to him for how we measure. But, if you think through it today, it was really easy when I first started in leadership positions in healthcare technology. You took your largest spend and said, well, we're going to take our biggest spend suppliers and assume that that represents the greatest qualitative measurement, right? But that may not actually represent the total. It's your dollars as a percent, but is it your real volume, right? Who are you really buying your batteries from? Those are the ones that you're probably not spending the most money with, right? If you really think of your global spend in healthcare technology management. So are you looking at those folks because they're not in the top 10 of your suppliers, but they're probably providing a greater portion of the repair product or the preventive maintenance product to your institution. So giving yourself some visibility to, what percent are your strategic vendors, and then what's your process for continuing to evaluate what means someone's a strategic vendor, right? So I think we use the term a lot pretty loosely now as an industry. I know Will and I've talked about this, is the difference between a vendor and a supplier. And I think it's easy to verbalize, but we've got to work harder as healthcare entities to bridge that gap and set a clear difference between here's what it means to be a supplier to my facility and here's what a vendor means. So Will, how would you define clear measurement?
Clear measurement, well, I'll camp out here just to put, as you say, a bow on this. You talked about what suppliers do we really focus on? And of course, that first bullet there, suppliers that compromise the largest portion of spend. And then you go to the suppliers that have a strategic relationship. That is your battery suppliers. It may not be your highest portion of spend, but you have to realize that there are some suppliers that are just one of the legs of the table, and without that supplier, the table falls down. But then also there are suppliers that you have a strategic relationship with as far as the future of the company goes. So if you're going to take a CT off contract, bring that at risk, how are you going to phase it off? There's no true spend with that supplier right now, but there is a long-term relationship of that supplier at stake. So I would just encourage everyone to look at these bullets when the PowerPoint comes out and say, who are the suppliers that come into this mix? Vendor consolidation aside, getting rid of that long tail of suppliers aside, if you at least document who these suppliers are, and that is where you start as far as your monitoring and working with them goes. So here is an example. This is a slide that just discusses the actual PartsSource quality management program. And just to give some background here, which many of the HTM professionals that have been around a while already know, the history of parts, of course, it started off, let's say, around 20 years ago, very utilitarian. That means it's just the utility of getting a part. And the OEMs may not have been that great at getting you the parts, because getting you the parts, it wasn't their top priority. And there might have been a little bit more redundancy in systems that you owned and less capacity demand from the health system itself. So it was a different world back then. And then it started switching to more of an opportunistic model where you would see organizations, and the good ones are still around today, that have picked a particular modality and said, we are going to be best in class as well as we could be on this particular modality. That might be an ultrasound supplier, that might be a patient monitoring supplier, a respiratory supplier, those suppliers that really focus on a single modality and try to do it the absolute best. And I think that the manufacturers of the equipment have responded to that increased pressure from the market and dropped some of their prices both on the parts, but on some of the at-risk service contracts. They've also increased their deliverability so that you're not waiting on them. If you buy from the OEM now, you could be rest assured that you're probably going to get it tomorrow if you need it overnight. So I've seen the pendulum switch back a little bit. 85% of what PartsSource buys currently is from the OEM. And now we're in very much more of an optimization phase where there's demand going both ways to the manufacturer's product, but also for secondary options. For PartsSource, we are an ISO certified organization. So we are ISO 9001, 2015 certified. We have gone through I think, three certifications, and each one they get more and more difficult as the nature of ISO goes. But for our quality management system, just on individual parts and the suppliers they come from, we have a lot of elements that come into it. Our vendor ranking module that fuels itself through quantitative and qualitative metrics on the supply chain. Quantitative being the information that is supplied on a transactional basis that we go back 3 years looking at data. How did they provide this modality? How well did they provide on this model? How well did they provide on this OEM? And how well can we reasonably assuredly say they're going to provide this part for us? And then we also have qualitative measurements, such as what is their quality management system? Are they ISO certified? Do we have we had an on-site source inspection? What documentation have we received from them? All those things percolate up into driving which actual option is shown to our customer. And then we have our choice program metrics on the right-hand side, and that goes into PartsSource itself having to consolidate its suppliers. You know, we are a vendor aggregator. We know that, and we have to buy from hundreds of suppliers, and that's the nature of who we are. But we really want to buy from a core group of suppliers of ultrasound. We really want to buy a core group of suppliers for C-arms, portable, cath. Just we have to know exactly who does what well. And as you get into some of the more specialized equipment, you'll get into some very specialized agreements that PartsSource has with suppliers, where it could be down to the specific model. Who is going to provide this particular model of CT, and how well are they going to provide that model? What is your fill rate going to be? What is your DOA rate going to be? What is your turnaround time, deliverability rate? How are you going to perform on that? So the evolving market and just the sheer volume of PartsSource has pushed us to a place where we need to have it completely automated, and we need to have a very robust quality management system. And understandably, that's not applicable for everybody. It's not possible to do that inside of other organizations that aren't going to invest the years and millions of dollars to put into it. But this is just to give you an example of what we look at when we're thinking about quality. So then finally, we will go back to Greg to talk about this life cycle, and then be wrapping up here and very shortly.
Thanks, Will. Yeah, and as you can see on the slide, so I'm going to reflect again back on the workflow that we talked about from previous slides. As you can see, we've kind of trimmed this down to 5 steps. And again, you know, as Will indicated, you can integrate with PartsSource, you can integrate with your ERP, you can integrate with other supplier partners. I think the attempt we're making here, as UnityPoint has and as other facilities that do supply chain quality analytics and measurement well, is get to the ideal state as fast as possible and get to what we call an 80-20 go rule as a function of the ideal state. I mean, everyone's going to have emergencies that don't fit your current purchasing processes. Everyone's going to have that one-off, that happens every time. You try to implement change in your parts and supply chain organization. It'll never work for this. So some of the steps, clearly you can take on your own, with little to no intervention, is identifying a best practice CMMS workflow. And so when my organization centralized and standardized across all of UnityPoint to be one department, one team doing all the same things on the same CMMS software system, is you evaluate your workflow. What is everybody's procurement solution? Clearly before 2015, we were not all on the same purchasing software. So we were disparate hospitals using disparate systems, doing some things well and many things over again. So I think I would encourage folks to just at least evaluate, what's the process by which your technicians procure parts? What is the opportunity that lies in, are we purchasing a great majority of them from the same people or not? I've worked in shops myself personally as small as 3 people, and you do develop, your niche suppliers for what you feel are your niche products that frankly scratch the itch when you need it scratched on performing repair and maintenance activities. So uncovering some of those stones to get to that, 80-20 go. If you have a system-wide ERP, I'd strongly encourage you to meet with supply chain if you haven't already, and discuss ways in which you could potentially integrate your CMMS. From my experience, I think there's not a CMMS software solution out there that I'm aware of that won't successfully integrate, or at least work with you to integrate with an enterprise resource planning system, which would get you a little closer to the procure-to-pay model, whereby you're punching in and out of your own supply chain and getting folks. That leads to giving you visibility. As we talk about, when you go back to that, what's your workflow? I can tell you one of our sharpest struggles when I meet with chief financial officers in my organization is trying to get to the granular level of who we spend with, what we spend, and then how we can impact that spend. And that is a kind of a forever frustration, if you will. And then, clearly partnering, using that as a grading tool. If you look at this step 1 through 5, is identifying your process that works, whether that is or not integrating with a PartsSource solution or not, is finding suppliers and grading them based on how effectively they can provide electronic invoicing, parts management, and giving you bi-directional feedback. And we'll talk about, leveraging the cloud in the next slide, but I just kind of turn your thought cap on, or put your thought cap on, as it relates to, what are some of the ways from a quality management of supply chain perspective that you can leverage your current supply chain partnerships and peers in your hospital. Trust me, it's highly likely with the volume of supply, Band-Aids, sutures, implants, and things, that your supply chain folks have some good quality analytics that they're using, that you can steal with pride, if you will, that they're using to grade suppliers. Some of them are requirements and some of them are not. It's just trying to figure out how many of those are square pegs for the clinical engineering round hole, if you will. And then, Will, if you'll jump to the next slide, excuse me, we'll talk about leveraging the cloud when we talk to inter-device interoperability, probably a little bit no different. Making sure that if you can use your enterprise management system, if you already have one, or leveraging a partnership with a supplier, and getting them to feed you that information. I'm a big proponent of doing less work where possible when it comes to interfacing systems. And this is one thing as well, what I would tell you, especially in having a really good relationship with your IT departments, it comes in handy. We talked a little bit earlier about managing that long list of hundreds of suppliers. As you begin to evaluate and quantify the sheer efficiencies and savings operationally you can gain by using service as a software model, connecting folks to your ERP, getting invoicing automated so that it's routed automatically in your system, you gain much more efficient data sets. And frankly, you'll also weed out some of your lower quality suppliers that, not to say again, they aren't putting out a quality product, but clearly I think the ones that tend to stand out in the quality metrics, as I've talked to Will, for a while about this, is you get extra brownie points for your ability to integrate with my software system, your ability to batch bill me, your ability to give me the data that I require my employees to give you when we place an order, so that when we do that procure all the way to pay, you eliminate the rework associated with routing, tracking, knowing that I've received a part. Will you give me access to FedEx information? Am I getting shipping details? Are you telling me when something's not going to ship so that I can manage a catastrophe if I need to? So, when we talk about using the cloud, I think that's the next really large tool as we think of healthcare technology management integration with supply and IT of the future, is getting more and more of our suppliers to talk to our software systems so that that system does the work for us. Will?
And as we look at this, I got some bullets here, utilizing the integrations into your asset management systems and your ERP to improve data, automating the purchase orders, improving reporting and analytics. Just some thoughts on that to close out. We're getting short on time. Just to call out a couple great wins in the industry where Trinity Health, they have Lawson as their ERP and they use Ames as their CMMS. And they actually push information from Lawson into the materials information into Ames. So they have extremely accurate chargeback information inside of their asset management system. That's something that they did on their own far before PartsSource came around. And then the automation of purchase orders. We're looking at GHX, excellent company to sort of connect the dots using EDI for your purchase order, your confirmation, tracking information, and then the invoices on the back end. I've also just witnessed at the University of Michigan, their IT department actually built a rec loader so that requests could come directly out of their asset management system, act as a requisition into their ERP, and then from there can automatically be turned into a purchase order. So that was a huge efficiency gain for the University of Michigan. And just a final thought on the overall analytics that we get. Of course, there are a lot of CMMS options out there. Data comes from those. Excellent data is being put in there. I encourage you to put that to use. And since they haven't signed an agreement yet, I do not want to use their name, but teaching organization, a pretty prestigious teaching hospital in the Northeast, they are currently looking for a CMMS. And one of the key elements they are looking for is what reporting can be brought out of this and given to me. Not just what data can I get or what raw data can I possibly work hard to get to, but what reporting, what can you crunch for us to get back to us? And those are the questions we really need to ask to our suppliers and say, I need you to get this information to me so that I can make better decisions. We constantly talk about this new cloud-based application as software as a service. And truly, we're looking for software and a service. So that holds truth for PartsSource as well. Call us and ask what is needed for your department. What information do you need to make better decisions? You should feel free to ask any one of your suppliers what their return rates are for any buckets of products that you're buying from them. So any manufacturer, any secondary supplier, they should be giving you this information and you should be making value-added decisions based off of those decisions. And Greg, if you could wrap it up for us.
I can. I'll do my best to bring it home. I guess in closing, as we talked about challenges and potential best practices, for everyone on the call, hospital supply chain, presents healthcare with a prime opportunity to mitigate, risk and lower expense. As you can imagine, supply chain, I think, is the second largest expense category for every healthcare system, likely in the United States. So there's four things that you need. Visibility, so that you can find issues early and often if you can't hit what you can't see. Traceability, so that as you identify issues or work with partners, you can understand root cause and what they're doing about it. You need to be accountable, right, and hold people accountable, and then clearly manage profitability. I think, as we think of quality, it can be an issue that comes up at any point in the process, so the faster the better. And I just implore folks, to continue to search for ways to establish more comprehensive supply chain quality metrics, improving organizations and expose yourself, to larger scale quality metrics and measurements so we can drive, the deficiencies out of healthcare in and of itself. I think that's our battle quest as healthcare technology management evolves.
All right, well, thank you everyone for your time. We will shortly switch over to questions. Just one final thought. I really hope you've learned something on today's webinar, and thank you again, Greg, for all of your expertise. The highest level of compliment I can give to Greg is that multiple people in the PartsSource organization have told me that they've learned something when talking to Greg. So excellent resource for understanding not only the industry, but supply chain as a whole, as well as dabbling in accounting, as it turns out from what I learned in breakfast the other morning.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you very much to Christy Dorofsky over on our side, who has done all the work for putting this together for us. And I will turn it now over to Jamie, who can put together the questions for us.
Perfect, Will. Well, we did have quite a few questions come in during the presentation. Since we are short on time, I'm going to try to get through as many as possible. But I want to remind all of the attendees, if we do not ask your question during the live webinar, we will send it over to PartsSource, where I am confident they will follow up with you offline quickly. Also, if you haven't submitted a question, but there's something you're curious about, please go ahead and shoot it over to us regardless of our time limit today. As I mentioned, we're going to send all questions over to the team. But Will, I'm going to pose questions to you. If it's something you want to hand off to Greg, please feel free. But first question is, this attendee is interested in vendor consolidation, but we are currently under contract with a few vendors. What are my options?
Well, I warned Greg that I'd be passing the buck to him as much as possible, but truly I think he would be better at explaining what the options are, you know, from his side, because he's done this multiple times.
Sure. Yes, I was warned. You know, I think, you know, UnityPoint has faced the same challenge. There are multiple suppliers. You're going to be in a multiple supplier environment in a lot of arenas. You know, I think first and foremost, as any good, you know, clinical engineering manager, director should tell you, I think finding clinical partners to help you in your evaluation of your suppliers, assuming that these are suppliers that you want to establish quality metrics, if you're trying to choose the services between multiple. So I'll go down that road as if there's multiple suppliers that are providing the same service and you're trying to find quality differentiators. You know, work with your customers to establish metrics, and then, you know, meet with those suppliers on their ability to deliver on those metrics, and then develop a system of accountability. You know, if you're talking about standardizing to medical devices, again, I would still encourage you to work with your clinical counterparts on, you know, why you have disparate systems that are driving disparate suppliers. And I think there's probably 100 hours worth of dialogue we can have on that topic. So if that didn't answer your question, please feel free to email me. We can set up a time and just chat about some of the things that we've done in my current organization and some of the things I've done in the past to try to manage, you know, to get the supplier of choice. Clearly, you have to identify what your choices are and why you want to choose to move a different direction. So,
and I would encourage anyone that has access to their spend data, that they know exactly what was bought and when for the past year. PartsSource does a spend analysis, can show you exactly how that long tail of suppliers can be consolidated into reduced suppliers. So if anyone wants to reach out to me afterwards of how that would look to have a spend analysis completed, pretty easy once the data is got on your side, so feel free to email that. Jamie?
Speaking of the spend analysis, I think that's a good tie-in to this next question. Do you have an average on what customers save annually with time spent ordering and cost savings when they use one outside vendor?
Absolutely. We had shown an overall procure-to-pay process that had an average of 84 minutes per invoice. I'm sure you've heard the AP department talk about how expensive it is for the hospital to process every single order. So we have seen that 84 minutes come down dramatically to in the 15 to 20 minutes. That area is the norm as we reduce a lot of the redundancies in work. We automate the purchase orders. In some cases, we've automated the requisition process. We do punch outs with the PeopleSoft and Lawson, McKesson, and others. So those automations exist. The reduction in reconciliations exist. And then we've seen a couple extreme cases where everything really lines up and we are integrated with the CMMS, the ERP. We have some form of EDI transfer of documents back and forth, limited reconciliation, and has got it all the way down to an estimated 90 seconds for the entire procure-to-pay process. So that really is the absolute high water mark and very hard to achieve, but if the stars align, that can be achieved.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to see if we can get through
I would concur with that.
One more attendee question. What is the process when a customer reports quality issues with parts?
All right, that question was actually brought up beforehand, and I had the benefit of time to go to our quality director and ask. And she said that we have a process inside our QMS as a part of our 9001-2015 quality certification to manage those issues. And depending on the number of issues, the severity, a few different paths that PartsSource specifically can take. One, we can simply monitor the supplier via scorecard on a quarterly basis. We can issue supplier corrective action reports, our SCARs, an apt name if you get a SCAR. And we also perform many on-site audits. Those have dramatically increased in the last 2 years. But in extreme cases where we feel that there is it's too much of a risk for PartsSource, we will suspend the supplier and we will no longer do business with them. So that's sort of the worst case scenario that we'd rather not get to. But even in the event of a simple recall, we also issue quality assurance bulletins to people that have purchased those specific SKUs from us.
Great, and I've gone through some of the attendee questions. I think this will be a really great last question. But again, attendees, if we didn't get to yours, we will send it over to Will and the team to follow up. But last question for this week, how do I sell this to stakeholders who are resistant to change?
I think it'll be best for both of us to speak on this, but it's good to reach out to me specifically, and we can have a phone conversation about your specific instance. You have stakeholders that might be below you as a manager, stakeholders that are above. Below, it's good to get them all on board and explain what the issues are and why there needs to be a change. Above, we can show you data about how this will cross-functionally benefit the organization, and we can empower you to give them better data so that they can make up their minds and then own the decision of change. And I would love to talk to you specifically if you can shoot me an email afterwards, and I will give you a call to talk about that. But Greg, if you can close us out, what are your thoughts on trying to force change at times if you have a big constraint of having to save $3 million and you have someone that's a little bit hesitant on change, how do you face it?
Sure, excellent. Yeah, that's a terrific question. And Will did a good job of pointing out you have multiple stakeholders. I think, first of all, the most important stakeholders to me as we made a transition not too long ago to centralizing some of our parts procurement was to actually talk to the frontline staff about how much time they were spending and about how much frustration. Again, I mentioned in the presentation, no one was intent on doing a bad job. Everyone was doing a great job of managing relationships. And so I think part of it is just how you identify efficiencies and then what you choose to leverage as your area or opportunity for improvement with your technicians. And clearly, from an executive leadership perspective and driving the change, data, and lots of data. And so if you can't analyze your own spend, it's projecting, what you think you might be able to save through staff efficiencies. And just in closing, what I would tell you is, as we've found efficiencies at UnityPoint Health, I want to strongly encourage, my peer group across the industry to look at it this way. We've partnered with suppliers of choice where we don't do services as well as they do as a function of measuring quality. And there are some things for risk purposes we choose as an industry not to do at UnityPoint Health. The rest is gravy. The rest is really opportunity. And so if I can go to a highly skilled, highly trained technician and offer him the opportunity to go to training to work on devices as opposed to spending a lot of time having to manage suppliers and order his own parts, we're definitely going to talk about that. And so it's not just the money you're going to save in trying to consolidate suppliers. I would also encourage you to look at it from us being a big part of the delivery of supply, right? Primary caregivers, treatment, and physicians' access to high-quality medical devices as fast as humanly possible. And one of the best ways to do that is to empower your team with the tools to do the most effective job. And I would tell you that most clinical engineers, while they do an excellent job procuring parts and trying to manage the supply chain, that's not the top of their license. The top of their license is working on the medical devices and doing things in the environment of care to protect our patients and provide a quality service.
Fantastic. Thanks, guys. And a great big thank you to PartsSource today. Please do visit their website, attendees. Find more information at PartsSource.com. As a reminder, one lucky attendee will win an Amazon gift card today for completing the post-webinar survey. This survey will appear shortly on your screen, so stay tuned. Yes, you do have to complete the survey to obtain your certificate. And if you do not see the survey for whatever reason, typically it's because you're on a tablet or your phone, please email us at webinar@mdpublishing.com. Our next webinar Wednesday is going to be on August 30th. You can find more information on this webinar as well as upcoming presentations, and as always, free registration at onetechnation.com/webinars. See you on the 30th. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.